Tonight, Trump's pick for vice president causing worries in Westminster and across Europe. JD Vance has suggested the new Labour government means the UK is now a truly Islamist country. He doesn't think the US should send aid to Ukraine, and he wants Europe to spend more on defence. Well, I've been asking the new Labour Defence Secretary about Trump's new running mate. John Healey tells me Vance is controversial, but that's no surprise. Also tonight, after just 4 months in the job, Vaughan Gething announces he's quitting as Welsh First Minister. 4 members of his government had resigned in protest over his leadership. Ahead of tomorrow's King's Speech, our Deputy Political Editor Sam Coates is asking whether we're about to see the most left-wing agenda since the 1970s. And we're talking about how Liz Truss is spending her time now she's no longer an MP, using her newfound freedom to pit Nigel Farage to the Republican National Convention. All that and more with Josh Simons and Bob Stewart, who will be with us for the next hour. It's Tuesday, I'm Sophy Ridge, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. Well, tonight I want to talk to you about JD Vance. You might not even have heard of him before yesterday, but trust me, he's a name that's going to become very familiar because he's Donald Trump's running mate. And if Trump does win the election, that means he will become vice president. JD, as he likes to be known, is the kind of guy who runs towards controversy. He once described Donald Trump as a terrible candidate and said he asked himself if he was America's Hitler. Well, he's changed his mind, obviously, since then. He's also against abortion, even if a woman was raped, and he thinks America has been sending far too much money to Ukraine. So JD Vance is, I guess, a kind of true believer. You know, if Trump seems to shapeshift through various guises, Vance has a philosophy. He's also one of the influential members of Congress that the new Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, has been on a bit of a charm offensive with. This is them at the Munich Security Conference together in February. And this is what Lammy had to say about him a month later.
I read Hillbilly Elegy as soon as it came out a few years ago, and I just thought JD Vance was just a wonderful book. What spoke to me, I suppose? Well, he spoke about working class America. He spoke about left behind communities. He has a strong faith. These are themes in my own political story.
Well, Vance has views that many people in the UK might violently disagree with, but he has thought about them. He's not going to change them, and this ideologue could have a huge impact on the next president. That matters when it comes to Ukraine because he doesn't think the US should keep sending them money. It also matters when it comes to the special relationship, which could become the not-so-special relationship if this is anything to go by. Just have a listen.
One of the big dangers in the world, of course, is nuclear proliferation, though, of course, the Biden administration doesn't care about it. And I was talking about, you know, what is the first truly Islamist country that will get a nuclear weapon? And we were like, maybe it's Iran, you know, maybe Pakistan already kind of counts. And then we sort of finally decided maybe it's actually the UK, since Labour just took over.
Well, I'll be talking to a member of the cabinet about those comments later in the show. But I guess the big question is, if Trump wins in November, how big an impact on foreign policy could JD Vance have as vice president? Let's try and explore that now. We can speak to Sky correspondent David Blevins, who's in Washington for us. David, just tell us about JD Vance then.
Well, Sophie, he's a relative newcomer, politically speaking, but we actually know more about him than we would have known about other potential vice presidents because of the book and the movie Hillbilly Elegy. He is, in many ways, a representative of the American dream. It's the complete rags to riches story. Growing up in abject poverty in the American Midwest, his father having abandoned the family, his mother a drug addict. He was raised by his grandmother, and she motivated him to aim high. He ended up studying law, not just at any college, but at an Ivy League college. And he went on to then reinvent himself as a venture capitalist in California, to then reinvent himself as a politician, being elected senator for Ohio just 2 years ago. And now you could argue reinventing himself as potentially the next vice president of the United States. And to get there, he's had to do a complete about turn in terms of his views on Donald Trump, a man he once described as America's Hitler, but he's changed his view on all of that and has apologised to Trump to the point where he's gone from being arch critic to being arch ally of the man who wants to win back the White House in November.
So David, just explain to me, why has Donald Trump chosen him? And I guess many people might be asking that question if you think about the past comments he's made.
Yes, I think it is a question being asked by many people, but I think there are various answers to it. Potentially, it's because of his youth. He's just 39 years old. And to put that in some sort of context, remember, Trump himself is 78, and Biden, the current incumbent who's seeking a second term, is 81 years old. He's got an individuality about him. He's not afraid to swim against the tide, to adopt his own position on issues like US aid for Ukraine. He sought to block the most recent aid package in the House. He's also very strong on conservative policy. He would hold the same position as Donald Trump on things like same-sex marriage and abortion, for example. And I think ultimately the reason he may have been chosen is that he will have an ability to connect with the working classes, an ability that many people at the top of US politics do not have an ability to do. So all of those things come into the picture when you're trying to figure out why exactly he's been chosen as the running mate. And in terms of his ability to influence politics, to influence Donald Trump, well, he's a very close friend of Donald Trump Jr., and we know the influence Don Jr. has over his father.
Very interesting indeed. Thank you very much, David Blevins there in Washington for us. Well, the prospect of a Trump win in November with JD Vance as his vice president will be met with extreme trepidation in Ukraine. And it could also mean the government here in the UK might need to revisit some of the assumptions underpinning its strategic defence review. That review was launched today by Keir Starmer and promises a root and branch review of the UK's armed forces. Sky Security and Defence editor Deborah Haynes reports.
A new kind of alliance as China and Russia strengthen ties in a shared challenge for the West. But it could also become a point of friction, even fracture between allies if Donald Trump returns to power. His new running mate sees Beijing as the biggest threat, not Russia and its war in Ukraine, even though support to Kyiv is a top priority for the UK. This is what JD Vance said before Moscow's full-scale invasion.
I think it's ridiculous that we're focused on this border in Ukraine. I got to be honest with you, I don't really care what happens to Ukraine one way or another.
And here's the potential future vice president this week.
I think what President Trump has promised to do is go in there, negotiate with the Russians and Ukrainians, bring this thing to a rapid close so that America can focus on the real issue, which is China. That's the biggest threat for our country, and we're completely distracted from it.
Speaking to Sky News, Britain's Defence Secretary tried to maintain a united front when asked about JD Vance's views.
Is that a position that you agree with?
My point to you is this. A NATO summit last week in Washington, for the first time, 32 nations together, bigger, stronger, more unified, with Ukraine involved, all standing together and stepping up support for Ukraine.
For Ukraine, there's alarm, but not despair.
I wouldn't say that there is such an atmosphere, in Ukraine that we believe that Trump, as the president of the US, will stop, supplies of the aid to Ukraine.
You don't believe that?
No, I wouldn't say so.
As well as Ukraine, there's concern about what a new Trump presidency would mean for the UK and other NATO allies if, as feared, there's a pivot by the US away from defending Europe to focus more on China, leaving the rest of the alliance to fend for themselves. The threat from friends as well as foes will surely frame a major review of defence launched by the government. John Healey is pledging a new era for defence. The big question is whether he can deliver. Deborah Haynes, Sky News.
Well, as you saw just then in Deborah's report, earlier I did speak to the Defence Secretary, John Healey. Thank you very much for being on the programme. So you've launched your defence review. You said we need to balance national security with sound public finances. So when are you going to set a date then for when you can reach that target of spending 2.5% of GDP on defence?
So it was the Prime Minister that's launched the Defence Review today. He's described it as one of these first acts leading this new government. It's this government getting on with the job. And we'll conduct our Strategic Defence Review. Alongside that, we'll settle the question of our manifesto commitment to raise defence spending to 2.5%, and that'll be done in the normal way, led by the Treasury through a fiscal event.
So when are you going to get what's the timing of it then, when we're going to get the time frame?
Well, that'll be led on the 2.5 by the Treasury, but that was a unique commitment in our manifesto, raising UK defence spending to 2.5%. It's not been at that level since 2010 with Labour, and we're doing that because we face increasing threats around the world, and that's why we're doing the Strategic Defence Reviews.
You say it will be led by the Treasury. Will you commit to following any recommendations of this review then? You know, if they say we should increase the inside of the army, will you then do that?
Well, one of the features about this review that the Prime Minister's launched today, which he's asked me to oversee, is that it will be led by a former Secretary-General of NATO, Lord Robertson. So you've got 3 expert external reviewers.
That's not really an answer to my question, though, is
well,
it?
It is.
I guess I'm trying to work out, are you in charge or is it Rachel Reeves in the Treasury?
No. The Prime Minister's asked me to run this defence review. I'm overseeing it. It'll be headed by Lord Robertson. It's the first of its kind in the UK to be done in this way. 3 expert external reviewers working with the deep internal experience that there is in the MOD and the armed forces and the rest of government. And we've done that so we can think afresh to deal with the threats that we face, make some assessment of the capabilities that we need, and get to grips with the rapidly changing nature of warfare today, which we see in Ukraine every day.
Yeah, you're talking about the kind of rapidly changing world. I think everyone would, agree with that. It's very clear in the US in particular. Donald Trump, of course, has one of his first kind of acts, if you like, has picked JD Vance as his running mate, a guy who could have a huge amount of influence if he does win the presidency. He said this about the UK. We were talking about what's the first truly Islamist country to get a nuclear weapon. Maybe it's Iran, maybe it's Pakistan, maybe they already count. And then we decided maybe it's actually the UK since Labour just took over.
Well, I don't think anyone here in Britain would recognise that caricature. Look,
politics is offensive, isn't it?
Well, politics is controversial. President Trump is controversial. It should be no surprise he's picked somebody who's also controversial as a running mate. Look, in the end, who the American people elect to be their president and vice president is for them. We, Britain, as we've always done in this very close alliance between the UK and the US, we will work with whoever the American people elect as their leaders. And this strong relationship at the heart of NATO, a 32-nation alliance, has seen through some ups and downs of political cycles on both sides of the Atlantic before.
I know you want to be careful here. You've got to kind of have the sort of diplomatic niceties. I get that. But you mentioned Ukraine earlier in this interview. JD Vance could have a huge impact, and Trump potentially, over what happens in Ukraine. In 2022, he said, I don't really care what happens in Ukraine one way or another. He also says he wants a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia and that Ukraine perhaps needs to accept that it's not going to get all of its territory back. Is that a position that you agree with?
Well, let's see what the American people do at their election. But we've launched this Strategic Defence Review to maintain the momentum of a very successful NATO summit.
Do you agree with JD Vance on Ukraine?
No, look, my point to you is this. A NATO summit last week in Washington, for the first time, 32 nations together, bigger, stronger, more unified, with Ukraine involved, all standing together and stepping up support for Ukraine.
Some people might be thinking they don't believe you when you're saying that you're backing Ukraine if you won't even call out JD Vance when he's saying that actually, maybe they should just give up, Crimea and start having peace talks with Putin. You won't call it out.
If people question or want to know the measure of our support for Ukraine, my second day in the job, I was in Odessa. I spent the afternoon with President Zelensky and his team. I pledged that we'll speed up the military aid that had already been pledged. We've stepped it up with more since then. We've said that we'll support them with $3 billion a year this year and every year for the rest of the decade, and we will work with them to see how we can help them in their fight against Putin's illegal invasion and how we can help also lead other allies to do more to support them.
OK, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, we'll be digesting what JD Vance's appointment means for a long time, and there'll be plenty of column inches written about him in tomorrow's newspapers as well, I'm sure. Our extended press preview and news review is coming up at 10:30 this evening. I'm sure Gareth Southgate's retirement and the latest Strictly drama will be featuring as well. Anna Botting will be joined by the broadcaster and commentator Ali Miraj and the Observer's chief leader writer Sonia Soda, so definitely worth a watch later tonight. Right, let's bring in our duo for this evening, shall we? The former head of Labour Together, someone you might recognise her on the programme, now newly elected MP from Macclesfield, Josh Simons, and the former Conservative MP, Colonel Bob Stewart. Great to have you both on the show tonight. Right, let's start off, shall we, with the JD Vance appointment. You're someone who's had, long connections with the military. Are you worried about what a kind of Trump presidency, a JD Vance vice presidency might mean for the world?
The one thing about democracies is that when people get into power, the reality of the position they're in often constrains them and stops them being radical. Now, we had Trump in before and everyone was fearful. We survived. If we have Trump again, I think, will survive. And I think that it's entirely right that we consider the position these people, once they're in power, they actually decide to do things sensibly. And I think that's what will happen in this particular situation.
What's your take, Josh? Do you agree with that?
I think that I don't share JD Vance's analysis of the distinction between, Ukraine and Russia and that conflict and China. I think actually it's much more sensible to see them as an axis. They're connected, they work with each other. But I think what you've seen from this government, the Labour government, is that David Lammy's done a really smart job of making sure that he goes to Washington and builds relationships across the aisle, as you would expect from a responsible foreign secretary. And, he has the relationship with JD Vance. And that is it's a good thing for our country, because it means that to the extent that the UK's national interest lies in working with the US government, whoever that may be, actually we are very well positioned and well placed to do that, regardless of what the American people decide.
At the same time, though, it was interesting, I thought, listening to John Healey and the interview there, because he didn't call out JD Vance when it comes to Ukraine. Do you think that's the right thing to do, or do you think actually we need to be a bit more robust with our allies when we strongly disagree with what they're saying?
Well, I think what the Defence Secretary is doing is paying attention to the thing that he's responsible for, which is the UK's defence policy, and not spending his time criticising or commentating on, a prospective vice president, not even the vice president's views on some foreign policy issue. And he was really clear, the second day after this government changed and the Labour Party formed the government, John Healey was in Odessa, demonstrating his commitment to Ukraine. And I think he's been clear that actually the UK government doesn't think that you can settle the conflict in Ukraine and somehow separate that from China and the threat to China. Those things are connected. They are two geopolitical powers who work with each other and have a relationship with each other. And for European security, for Britain's security, Ukraine is of absolutely utmost importance. And that's what you would expect from a UK Defence Secretary.
Are you worried about what the future looks like for Ukraine?
Of course, because Ukraine really matters. The problem is that Ukraine is something we can't really touch under the NATO agreement. I always, when I was Chief of Policy at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, my last job in the Army in 1996, repeatedly I went to the Supreme Allied Commander and said, firstly, be careful about expanding NATO eastwards, and secondly, NATO should actually change so it becomes a sort of Western alliance right the way across the globe, so that we can take in places like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and Malaysia, for example, Singapore. And so I think, am I worried about Ukraine? Yes, of course I am. It's taken far longer than we thought it would. And we've just got to keep supporting. We cannot, I've got part of my family are involved in what's happening in Ukraine insofar as they're operating on the borders of Ukraine. So I've got a bit of skin in this fight, and I think we've got to support Ukraine. We don't have a choice. Ukraine has got to win in the end, But in the end, I think there will be a compromise. We don't have any choice. And whether we can get places like Donetsk back, I doubt it. We certainly won't be able to get the Crimea back for Ukraine. Ukraine won't be able to get it back. And in the end, there will be a compromise. Politics will win. And in the meantime, the military have just got to try and hold the ring and get to that position where politics can sort it out.
And I think the fascinating thing, to bring it back to UK politics, during this general election campaign, I knocked on hundreds of doors in my constituency of Makerfield, and actually the British public have a really keen sense of the world that we're entering into now. I think they really feel the insecurity of this moment and the importance that, a UK government needs to place on defence. And I think, for a Labour government that's just got into power, just taken the reins, we are immediately talking about defence, security, making sure our borders are safe and secure. And I think that the public understand that we are living in a more insecure world than we have lived in for decades.
The Strategic Defence Review is absolutely right for a new government, particularly a Labour government coming in after all these years. That's absolutely right. We've got a very good Defence Secretary, in my view. And actually, in the end, we will have to put the Defence Review within a budget. And the Labour Party have promised that they'll increase defence to 2.5%. And I hope that they will, because, my goodness, in my view, the threats are so great from 4 nations, Russia, China, North Korea and Iran.
OK.
They're so great that we've got to do something about it.
We'll find out when Labour managed to put a timeframe on that. Thank you both very much indeed. Well, Sky's Yalda Hakim is at the RNC in Milwaukee for us. She's going to be presenting the world from there tonight here on Sky News at 9 p.m. Yalda, good to see you, of course. It's just been an extraordinary few days, hasn't it, for Trump, for the Republican Party, for America, for the world?
Yeah, I mean, Sophie, that seems like an understatement. And now Milwaukee, as it prepares for day 2 of this RNC, is in complete lockdown. As you can imagine, security is incredibly tight in and around the city, and certainly around the convention centre, given what happened at the weekend. These things are always full of security, Sophie. But as they prepare to, get ready for day 2 of this convention, it certainly did feel like there was a lot of security around. They're not taking any chances. And of course, we saw President Trump appear yesterday, his right ear bandaged following that incident, that assassination attempt in Pennsylvania at the weekend. A big day yesterday when you think about it, Sophie. I mean, not only did we see President Trump for the first time since the incident, but we also heard him announce his vice presidential nominee, J.D. Vance. So there was a lot of energy in the room here yesterday. There are preparations today. The media is here. Some of the delegates are here. And they are expecting to get started in the next few hours. We are expecting to see J.D. Vance again today. No word yet of President Trump. It is unusual to see the presidential nominee so early on in the week. Usually, and in previous years, it's been later in the week. But Donald Trump does things differently. In 2016, he appeared on the first day. 2020, you'll remember, of course, because of COVID, all of these things were done remotely. So this has a very different feel, a very different energy this year. And given what happened only a few days ago, it also has a very different meaning for the Republican Party, for all the delegates here, and certainly for former President Trump.
Yeah, well, it'll be really interesting to see what you've got coming up later on that programme, Yalda. Good to talk to you, as always. Yalda Hakim there in Milwaukee. And, of course, Yalda is presenting that special programme live from the Republican Convention. That is The World with Yalda Hakim at 9 p.m. You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, Liz Truss beats Nigel Farage in the race across the pond to show support for their friend Donald Trump. We'll discuss what's next for the former PM. And we'll also be looking ahead to the King's speech tomorrow with a preview of the raft of bills set to shape the next Parliament. Welsh First Minister Vaughan Gething steps down just 4 months into the job. We'll have that story next.
Three, two,
One.
We've got an election, haven't we?
We'll start with the rehearsals. Let's do that again, one more time.
You've got to be the best, but that is quite a lot of pressure.
It's just keeping up with everything.
You don't know what's going to happen day to day.
And being forcibly removed.
You've got to beat your journalistic competition. Every day matters.
That was a very tense interview, and I'm still slightly shaking.
You train hard and you fight easy, and I think that's what we're doing.
It was always going to be controversial. The Capri, when it was alive, people held a lot of affection for it because it was an affordable sports car that looked good. And now we've got a tall SUV selling for nearly double what the average person thinks a Ford should be selling for. So yeah, it was always going to be controversial, but they've done it before. They have formed this in reviving old names with the Puma, the Mustang Mach-E onto SUVs. They've obviously tested the market and thought, yes, people can handle it. They'll be talking about it, and Ford reckons it's one of the most talked about launches they've ever done. But whether they're talking about it for the right reasons is another question. Really, it was always ever going to be an SUV because that's what people buy nowadays. I mean, your son saying it's the worst remake is one view. My son, who's 12, thinks it looked cool. He saw it at Goodwood Festival of Speed and saw the front and rear light bars. They looked high tech. He liked it. So, a modern generation who let's face it, can never remember the original car. They actually, think it's quite cool. I mean, the Festival of Speed, these are car enthusiasts. And they're generally older. I mean, it's an older crowd. So, it didn't go down terribly well. Let's face it. And it was never going to. I don't think Ford is going to be expecting a whole uprush of affection for it, but that doesn't matter. It just has to appeal to the right person who needs an electric car, who wants an electric car, but also wants a bit of emotion attached to it, and can see that this adds a little bit of pizzazz in a world of sort of sameness.
Hello, welcome back. You're watching the Politics Hub on Sky News. The top stories tonight. Donald Trump has chosen JD Vance as his running mate in his bid for the White House. The Welsh First Minister Vaughan Gething has quit after just 4 members of his government resigned in protest over his leadership. And a fortnight on from his election victory, Keir Starmer has promised a packed programme when he sets out his legislative agenda in the King's Speech tomorrow. We'll have more on that in just a moment. And you can stay up to date with all the goings-on in Westminster on our digital politics hub by scanning the QR code at the bottom of your screen, among the other stories we've been covering that you can read about today, including the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, writing to local leaders promising to oversee a devolution revolution. She's written to leaders of councils not currently subject to a devolution deal to urge them to partner with the government. The Labour MP Clive Lewis has been sworn into Parliament for a second time after he failed to use the correct wording in his first attempt last week. He said he was pledging allegiance to the King under protest. Now he risked being fined or losing his seat for not using the correct wording. And the International Monetary Fund has confirmed that it is expecting the UK economy to grow faster than previously expected this year. It has predicted last October that UK growth will be the slowest of all the G7 nations this year, but now it expects it to be in the middle of the table. All that and much more, just scan the QR code on the bottom of your screen. Or we can go to Wales now, where Vaughan Gething has announced he's going to quit as the Welsh First Minister. The first black leader of a European country has stepped down after just 4 months into the job. 4 cabinet members resigned from his government this morning, forcing his hand really, saying that they couldn't back him after he lost a vote of no confidence last month. Our Wales correspondent Dan Whitehead reports.
Now make your official affirmation before me.
118 days after being sworn in, Vaughan Gething is now out. Political pressure has mounted on Wales's First Minister for months. From campaign donations to leaked COVID messages, it finally came to a head.
I have this morning taken the difficult decision to begin the process of stepping down as the leader of Welsh Labour and, as a result, the First Minister. In 11 years as a minister, I have never, ever made a decision for personal gain. I have never, ever misused or abused my ministerial responsibilities. My integrity matters. I have not compromised it.
The scrutiny on Vaughan Gething has been intense. Criticism over a £200,000 donation from a company whose owner had criminal convictions, to questions over the sacking of former Minister Hannah Blythen, who he accused of leaking messages to the press, something she denies. It led to him losing a vote of confidence in Parliament last month, and to 4 of his cabinet resigning today.
Vaughan Gething insists that his integrity is intact and that he has broken no rules. But all of the scandals during his short tenure clearly meant he felt he couldn't continue.
Shortly after his resignation, a word from his predecessor.
It's a very sad day, of course, for him personally, but I believe that he has done the right thing by his party and his country.
And who do you think should be the new First Minister?
I have absolutely no thoughts on that matter today.
Thank you, Mr. Director.
Some political opponents would rather a snap election than a Labour coronation.
I think the people of Wales are losing faith in the ability of Labour to govern in Wales after 25 years, put it in the hands of the Welsh people in an election.
That's not on the cards as it stands. It'll likely be after the summer break before a new First Minister takes over here. Dan Whitehead, Sky News in Cardiff.
Coming up next on the Politics Hub. No longer an MP, but Liz Truss has headed to the RNC to show support for Donald Trump. Can the former PM break America? And up next, we'll be looking ahead to the King's Speech when Keir Starmer sets out his legislative agenda and asking what it tells us about Starmerism. welcome back. Well, tomorrow, Keir Starmer will set out his legislative programme in the King's Speech and set about translating the Labour manifesto into reality. More than 35 bills are expected to be included in the speech, among them plans to nationalise the railways and measures on workers' rights. From what's been revealed so far, it appears there's going to be a lot more government centralisation and the state intervening a bit more directly. Now, that has led our deputy political editor, Sam Coates, to ask if this could be the most left-wing agenda since the 70s.
Just how bold? Just how radical? And is this man borrowing ideas from an earlier era? Public ownership, more central government control, and strengthening trade union rights. After 14 years going in the other direction, all of that at the core of Labour's first King's Speech. Is this the most left-wing plan for government since the 1970s? The most senior union figure in the country says it could be.
I think without doubt it's going to be a radical King's Speech, and it needs to be when you look at the scale of the challenges that the government's facing. And I think it's sending a very clear message out to the electorate that the government will stand by working people, their families and communities. They'll intervene. You can use the label left-wing. I actually think it's a King's Speech that's going to meet the needs of the British people.
A flagship bill to create Great British Railways, to bring trains back into public ownership. Every train company back under state control by the end of the Parliament. Sir Keir Starmer, the first Prime Minister in 4 decades to embrace government solutions to private sector problems like this. A programme for the next 18 months. Signed off only on the 3rd occasion this cabinet has ever met. Greater control of the curriculum, forcing councils to build homes or banning cigarettes for anyone born after 2009.
That's the big difference between now and the last time Labour was in power. Under Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, they were prepared to splash the cash, but appeared cautious about the involvement of government in people's lives. But when the King delivers his speech, Starmerism will appear the reverse. Not much money to spend, but much greater state intervention. Will it work?
The most contentious part of all, Angela Rayner's plan for workers, repealing Tory trade union restrictions, collective bargaining in social care, and giving employees a right to switch off from work out of office hours. Is this a challenge for bosses?
It needs to be done in consultation with business and how we work together to make sure there aren't any unintended consequences. We don't want this to lead to fewer jobs being created here in the UK or have an impact on our overall international competitiveness.
The speech the King delivers in here needs to show Keir Starmer is thinking big. How radical will it truly feel? He will never be this powerful again. Sam Coates, Sky News, Westminster.
Well, Sam joins me now. Sam, I'm going to throw that question that you posed at the end of your VT right back at you. How radical do you think the King's Speech is going to be?
Well, you can never tell from a King's speech because it's like a giant press release. What it is the government in very broad brush terms telling you what bits of legislation it wants to pass over the next 12 to 18 months. And Sophie, it entirely depends what that legislation then looks like when it's published, how it gets through internal government processes, what the various rows do to it, and what gets passed by Parliament. So it's all very well having the ambition, but what comes out the other end is the stuff that matters. But what I do think is it tells you a little bit about the character of the government. And if you remember, the last King's Speech was dominated by rows about whether or not local authorities should be given powers to take tents away from homeless people. This is a King's Speech on an entirely different scale and order. But the thing that's striking, as we were saying in that report, is just how much Keir Starmer is comfortable with the state getting involved, whether it's the centralisation and government control of curriculums and more control over schools, whether it's nationalisation, not just of trains, as you were seeing there, but of buses as well. All across the piece, there's a comfort that you haven't seen for the last 14 years in the state getting involved.
And that's why you're saying, is this the most left-wing King's Speech since the 70s, then?
That's the question that we're asking. The head of the TUC seemed to agree with that. And you've got this big package of workers' rights as well that could see a right not to be disturbed over the weekend and collective bargaining coming back in social care, which I think would be absolutely fascinating. So across an entire sector, a sort of higher than minimum wage being negotiated by effectively the state. These are big changes if they happen. Let's see what happens next.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see, won't it? Sam, thank you very much indeed. Sam Coates there, our Deputy Political Editor. And I should say that I'm going to be on your screens from 10 a.m. tomorrow when we're going to have full coverage of the King's speech. So I'll be joining you from 10 a.m. tomorrow for that. We'll have a bit of Sam, I'm sure, as well. Well, voting on that legislative agenda is a record number of newly elected MPs. 335 of them are going to take their places on the green benches for the first time and go towards making this the most diverse House of Commons in history. There are more female, ethnic minority and out LGBTQ plus MPs in the House of Commons at the start of this Parliament than ever before. Sky's political correspondent Gurpreet Narwin has been taking a closer look.
This was an election of historic firsts, and when the King opens Parliament tomorrow, it will look like a very different place. We now have 412 Labour MPs, the red dots over here, 72 Liberal Democrats, that's their highest ever tally, and just 121 Conservatives remain. But it's not just the political backgrounds that have changed. This election saw the highest influx of new MPs sworn into Parliament, 335 of them finding their places on the green benches this week. That is a record number. And 263 members of our new Parliament are now women. That's more than 40% for the first time. And you can see the progress. As recently as 1983, just 3.5% of MPs were women. Parliament has now become more ethnically diverse than ever before, too. 90 MPs in the 2024 intake are from an ethnic minority background. 14%, up from 10% in the last Parliament. It's a huge increase. Look at 1987, when just 4 MPs from ethnic minority backgrounds were elected. That's making up just 1% of Parliament. Among them, Diane Abbott, then the first black woman to ever enter the Commons. And 17% of the British population come from ethnically diverse backgrounds. So Parliament now more closely reflects the diversity of the electorate. And it doesn't stop there. Another historic first for the UK Parliament, we now have the largest number of out LGBTQ MPs. You can see 64 of them. But there's still work to do. Despite progress, 23% of MPs attended a private school. That's compared to just 7% of the population. But when we look at Sir Keir Starmer's new cabinet, just 1 out of 25 went to private school, Louise Haigh, and 1 to grammar school, the Prime Minister. 92% were educated at a comprehensive school. That's a huge leap up from 19% in the cabinets of Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. So we've got the most diverse Parliament ever. But will it translate into diverse communities being better served? Sir Keir Starmer says he's proud of the achievement, but for now at least, it's a symbolic one.
Gurpreet Narwin there. Right, let's bring in Josh and Colonel Bob again, shall we? Josh, you're one of the new MPs, aren't you, in Gurpreet's report there. I just wondered, do you agree with the kind of... What's your response to that Sam Coates question? You know, is this going to be the most left-wing King's speech since the 70s?
Well, there is this sort of idea that, you know, now Labour's won an election and got a strong majority, that now what it's going to do is all those secret things that it had in, you know, dust them off and take them out the closet and now do all these radical left-wing things that secretly Labour's always wanted to do, and now we have an opportunity to do. And I think that's exactly what you won't see from this government. This Labour Party will govern as it campaigned, i.e. prudently, responsibly, right, with an eye to voters who, you know, all the way through this campaign, you heard Rachel Reeves, Pat McFadden, Keir Starmer, they argued again and again and again, the British people often do not trust Labour with our security and our finances. And if the British people stop trusting the government with either of those things, we will lose the next election and they will fail to do the one crucial thing that we must, all of us as politicians, do, which is rebuild trust in politics. So I think they will govern much as we campaign.
You're nodding along.
Yes, I agree with that. I think, you know, being in government governs exactly how you behave. And you actually are sort of governed by your position. And you've got to do things sensibly. And the British people don't normally like revolution. They like evolution. And so that's, I think, what will happen. And I mean, for example, you're going to provide a blueprint for the NHS, you're going to solve the boat people coming across, I was hoped that in the King's speech tomorrow there'll be something on how the Labour government are going to deal with these people that are coming in. It's not just the people on boats, it's the illegal immigration, other ways too. But let's not just concentrate on that. We've got to actually look at how the NHS is going to be reorganised, how schooling is going to be reorganised. We already announced the nationalisation of the railways. Good luck with that, by the way. Good luck.
Can I ask something, though? Because Labour talks a lot about devolution, right? About the mayors, about devolving power, about decentralising power. And yet, actually, if you look at a lot of the stuff in the King's speech, it does feel like quite a lot's actually being centralised, whether it's the railways, whether it's planning. I mean, what do you think?
No, it's such an important point, this. I think there's a completely different theory of what it means to devolve power that underpins this Labour government from Boris Johnson's levelling up argument. Boris Johnson's theory of levelling up in practice was Whitehall, you bid to Whitehall for money, Whitehall gives you some money and then it tells you what to spend it on. Plant pots, fancy cobbled streets, whatever, mostly kind of aesthetic things. The Labour theory of what devolving power means is much more focused on productivity growth and on the economy. And therefore, what the different bits of the argument that's in this King's speech will look like is we need to make sure that we are providing places with what they need to have a more productive economy. It's about economic growth and jobs.
If they're doing things that they don't like because it's not going to help growth and they're not allowed to do it, that also is overriding, local government where you see fit as well, though, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think having honest conversations with local governments about... It's often, by the way, not actually local governments who object to some of the things that we need to do to grow. It's actually, local governments who found that they're constrained by small, vocal pockets of the population who often are wealthier and have more power rather than the actual local governments themselves. But, any government that respects a devolved power... That doesn't mean you necessarily have to do what the devolved power says, because there are national objectives like infrastructure and so on. But I think the important thing is, in order to get an economy growing, you have to respect the sort of productive capacity of towns and places across the UK, and not just expect that handing out money from Whitehall is going to make any long-term sustainable difference.
Have you been impressed by Keir Starmer so far?
I think he's done OK. He's been calm, and I think, as I mentioned earlier, his position has actually governed the way he behaves. And as for levelling up, I mean, let's just see what the government does when the levelling up process gives resources out and they don't like what's happening with those resources. That's the key. Okay. What's going to happen then?
Thanks both very much indeed. Still to come on the Politics Hub. Liz Truss has jetted across the pond to the RNC, stealing a march on Nigel Farage, who, because he's an MP, well, he's got to stay for the King's speech. We'll take a look at Truss on tour. That's next.
Coming up on the UK Tonight at 8, the mum of Jay Slater says his family's hearts are broken after his body was formally identified in Tenerife. I'll be speaking to the charity that's been representing the family during their desperate wait for news. Also ahead, we'll look back at the reign of Gareth Southgate after he stepped down as England men's boss. I'll be speaking to his former captain as a player and one of the starting 11 from his first game as England manager. That and more coming up on the UK Tonight at 8 o'clock.
When you cover big, tense protests, there's almost always a moment when the atmosphere changes. There's a different noise, and you start to smell tear gas in the air.
As a team, we've interviewed some of the biggest stars in the world. Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt. It can be incredibly surreal being swept up in their world, but we try to give you an honest sense of how these people really are.
When we spoke to the fishermen down in Cornwall, all the politics from Westminster was a million miles away. This was about their jobs, their livelihoods.
Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. Well, we were going to talk about Liz Truss going over to the Republican National Convention, but actually someone else has gone one better, because Boris Johnson has just tweeted this. He's met President Trump. He tweeted to say, "Great to meet President Trump, who's on top form after the shameful attempt on his life. We discussed Ukraine, and I've no doubt that he will be strong and decisive in supporting that country and defending democracy." So there you have the photo of Boris Johnson meeting Donald Trump. All smiles, they're doing their thumbs up there, and the significance, of course, that Boris Johnson's saying that they did discuss Ukraine, because there's been lots of questions about whether or not Donald Trump, as president, would continue the support from Ukraine, something that Boris Johnson has been campaigning on around America. Well, there you go, Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. Interesting to see the comments on Ukraine as well, Josh.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing slightly gives me the heebie-jeebies. You know, failed ex-Conservative prime ministers jetting off across the pond for the Republican National Convention. I saw a picture earlier of Boris Johnson's audience in the Republican National Convention, which I think had about 4 people in it. And it's just a bit weird, you know, these politicians, until very recently, their job was to represent their constituencies in Parliament and to represent the people of the UK. And, you know, as soon as they're done with that job, they're sort of like moths to a flame, off to the Republican National Convention, talking about Donald Trump, you know, talking about JD Vance. I just find it odd and undignified.
What do you reckon?
Could be. They're not representing the Conservative Party, you know, neither are members of Parliament. But at the same time, you could argue the more friends we have across in the United States, the better. So you could put it there. I go somewhat along your lines, but frankly, I don't know why they're there.
I guess Boris Johnson, though, has been campaigning and focusing for a long time now on support for Ukraine. And at a time when there is big question marks about what Donald Trump is on it, and of course the pick for his running mate as well, maybe Boris Johnson is someone who's got a bit of influence. Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that Boris Johnson can turn around the ship of American foreign policy in Washington, D.C. is for the birds. You know, what Boris Johnson is doing is getting his tweet out so that we can talk about it, and he's still in the news, and it's just a desperate search for relevance. Same with Liz Truss. Why are you there? You know, why are you talking about it? So, you know, while I totally agree that it's important to make friends across the pond who believe in supporting Ukraine, the idea that Boris Johnson can have any influence over that when he's neither elected nor a member of the government, nor apparently representing the Conservative Party.
You know, when I was in the military, there is such a thing as democracies get war fatigue. They get fed up with, you know, the situation. And perhaps people should remember the threat that's actually happening close to us. Ukraine is a huge country. Ukraine is a European country. We've got to actually maintain the effort. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why people like Johnson and Truss are over there. I hope it's not just for personal reasons.
Do you think Liz Truss is going to be a bit annoyed that Boris Johnson pipped her to the post?
I'm bloody sure of it.
Oh, apologies for any language used. I think that's we probably got away with that, but thank you very much. I mean, it is, everyone's keen to get over there, aren't they, though?
They are, and, you know, it's sort of interesting to me, the kind of, if you zoom out a little bit, we have become used to this Westminster Conservative psychodrama in which Boris Johnson's pipping Liz Truss and then Liz Truss is shooting from the hip about Boris Johnson or the Bank of England or whatever. And actually, the Labour Party are in government now, and we're not talking about Labour Party Westminster psychodrama. We're talking about a really credible, sensible Defence Secretary who you've spoken to earlier, who has demonstrated his commitment, the government's commitment to Ukraine. And, you know, because the Labour Party are getting on with the job of governing, you know, doing politics in a sort of slower, more focused, determined way, we're left with the sort of entrails of a Conservative Party that's imploded and, you know, is fighting with each other on the other side of the Atlantic at this point.
We've just got to make sure that our government, my government, your government, our government gets it right with the United States, because I'm thinking we require United States support for NATO, huge amount of support from the United States. And Mr. Trump, if he becomes president, President Trump has got to support NATO.
There we go. We're out of time. Thank you both very much indeed. That's it from us tonight. I'll see you tomorrow at 7. Up next, it is UK Tonight with Matt Barr.